Okay, so I missed class on June 4th, Thursday, because I really was not feeling well. So I did the makeup assignment for the solitary confinement, which is the project I think we did that day. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to do one or all three, so I did all three briefly to make it a 30-minute video. So, alright, let's get started. So, right off the bat, solitary confinement is the practice of isolating people in closed cells for as much as 24 hours a day. It strips people of their human contacts for a period of times that could range from days to decades. A lot of prisons don't actually even use the term of solitary confinement anymore as of recently. Instead, they refer to it as prison segregation or placement in restrictive housing. So, with that, we're going to get into legal and ethical dimensions. So, oh my god, sorry. My allergies are terrible. Um, yeah, okay. So there are four types of solitary confinement, I guess, in general. Like, this is like the general description I could find was administrative segregation, disciplinary segregation, protective custody, and temporary segregation. So administrative segregation is used when people are perceived as threats to prison safety and order, but they aren't in direct response to a rule violation. They're usually separated until they're no longer deemed as safety threats, meaning that they could spend decades in solitary confinement. These are commonly used to control prison gangs. They're also all subjective, based on the correctional officers and administrators' perception of a person's threat to an institution. So, with that in mind, just remember that it's based on whether or not the people in charge think that you're a threat, which I always think is really interesting because, like, there's been so many issues with corrupt correctional officers that it's like, they could really just do whatever they want because they have so much power. So, you never really know with that kind of thing. But then with disciplinary segregation, it is time-limited sanctions for rule violations. So reporting staff members have to actually present evidence of a rule violation to an internal board or committee and go through a hearing process. That way the incarcerated individual can defend themselves if they think that this was wrongly accused. Then there's protective custody, which is for people whose safety is at risk, which is commonly those convicted of sex crimes, younger people, elderly people, people with disabilities. They're usually held there indefinitely. Then, temporary segregation is used to hold people awaiting transfer to other institutions or to transport them to judicial proceedings. Also holds people involved in crime investigations and people whom there is insufficient bed space. Anyways, now we're going to get into the federal versus state, juvenile versus adult. So, federal prisons refer to solitary confinement in the lower disciplinary and administrative segregation as special housing unit, also known as the SHU. For more serious cases, they use the term special management units, but I think for the most part they use SHU. Because I couldn't find anything about special management units. I could only find stuff about the SHU. So, with that being said, administrative segregation in federal prison also refers to segregation used for protective purposes and temporary housing. So the two we mentioned earlier fall under the umbrella of administrative segregation in this case. Some states can have supermax prisons, which means the entire prison population is placed in solitary confinement. The federal government runs a supermax prison that is reserved for people requiring the tightest supervision for their behavior in prison. And according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, approximately 7.7 of inmates are housed on SHU. So, getting into SHU, you could be alone or with other inmates. It's usually like 2 or 3 people, so it's never that many people, but for the most part, it's alone. But there's sometimes inmates, and that's an issue I'll address later on because I don't agree with that at all. I think solitary confinement, if you're really going to stick to what it is by the book, it should be individuals. It should not be with another person, because if they're in there for a specific reason and that reason has to do with prison gangs or has to do with violence or has to do with anger issues, why would you want to place them with another person who's identical as them? That just feels contradicting, if I could say so myself. A thing that I thought was interesting was that a warden could impose more restrictive conditions on inmates who are causing serious disruptions, like threatening life, bodily harm, or property in administrative detention. Inmates who cannot be controlled within the physical confines of administrative detention, or inmates who are, upon advice of qualified health personnel, does not require confinement in the institutional prison, Like, they can't safely be housed there because the hospital doesn't have a room or cell with adequate security provisions. Here are some conditions of federal prison confinement. Living quarters are well ventilated, adequately lighted, appropriately heated, and maintain a sanitary condition. Ordinary housing, only the amount of occupants with which it was designed. So if it was designed for one inmate, they're not gonna put 5 people in there. Like how we described that thing with like the 5 beds and 1 toilet. That's not happening for the most part. You'll receive institutional clothing, including footwear, mattress, blankets, pillows, and linens for sleeping. Those can be interchangeable. You'll receive nutritionally adequate meals, access to like your toilets and all that stuff, and personal items as needed, like toilet tissues, soap, toothbrush, toothpaste, shaving utensils, etc. You'll have the opportunity to shower and take care of yourself, I guess, at least 3 times a week. Exercise, you also have access to that for 5 hours a week. That's the outside of your little cell. Personal property may be limited for reasons of fire safety or sanitation. You are allowed a reasonable amount of personal property and access to commissary in administrative, but in disciplinary, your personal property will be impounded with the exception of limited reading and writing materials and religious articles like the Quran, the Bible. Also, your commissary privileges may be limited. Disciplinary, obviously going to be a little stricter. You'll receive your correspondence privileges, telephone privileges, visiting privileges, opportunity to perform legal activities. You're monitored by the staff assigned to the SHU. In administrative, you'll have access to programming activities, while in disciplinary, though, it might be suspended. So, now we're getting on to states. I couldn't find much about other states because each state and jurisdiction does things differently, but I looked more into Washington State. So, their restrictive housing refers to housing assignments for incarcerated individuals who are either a danger to self, a danger to others, or who present an unacceptable risk to facility security. Solitary confinement, on the other hand, though, is a specific status within restrictive housing setting. It refers to the confinement of incarcerated individuals in a single occupancy cell for more than 20 hours a day without meaningful contact, out-of-cell activities, or opportunities to access more common spaces. So, like, I feel like they're a little stricter than federal prisons when it comes to that. Like, they aren't as lenient with that ideology. I think it's mainly because they are smaller prisons than a big federal prison, so they have more space, I guess, to do, like, individuals, people like that. They also do have an administrative segregation program that follows pretty similar requirements to federal prisons, but I really couldn't find that much information about it, but, whatever. When it comes to youth, however, the use of solitary confinement for younger people, like minors and stuff, varies by the state. So some states choose to really use it and some states don't. However, no state has outright banned the program, which I think is really interesting. I don't love the idea of solitary confinement for minors who commit crimes. I mean, like, if they are a violent tendency, I feel like there are alternatives that you could use, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. 24 states, plus DC, have enacted statutory limits or prohibitions on the use of youth solitary confinement and restricting its use to immediate safety threats rather than discipline, which I agree with. Like, it should be used in an immediate safety threat instead of using it to discipline people, both in adult and youth prisons. 27 states, however, have placed limits on juvenile solitary confinement through statutes, regulation, policy, or court order, which means they cap the number of hours, they require periodic observation, and banning it as a punitive measure. 11 states, however, don't have clear statutes or administrative rules, so they're just like, do whatever you want, which I think is really interesting. Unlike the youth solitary confinement, adult isolation just remains standard as a correctional practice. Adult solitary confinement can last for months or years, and they're often used as a punitive measure, while youth confinement, on the other hand, is generally defined as a room confinement or seclusion. This is meant to be more short-term intervention and used to only stop immediate threat of harm or escape. I personally think, okay, When it comes to whether or not solitary confinement may violate the Eighth Amendment, I have really mixed feelings about it. I think the general idea and if we followed it by the book of solitary confinement, where when it is used as a form of like protecting people and used correctly, then I don't think it violates the Eighth Amendment. The issue with solitary confinement is when correctional officers are corrupted, then it becomes an issue because then you don't really know what's happening. I can see the issue with how it can be a cruel and unusual punishment, but I, for the most part, don't think it violates the Eighth Amendment because it is a matter of who's in charge of the solitary confinement. I think when it is necessary to be used for the safety of your other inmates, and when it is used correctly, I don't think it violates the Eighth Amendment. But the problem is that's not something we can control. It is something that needs to be reshaped in the system, obviously. I think right now, like with the current state of our country, yes, I do think it violates the Eighth Amendment because the people who are supposed to be regulating it aren't doing it right. Like, they are using it as a cruel punishment instead of using it the way it was intended to protect others. But if we were to use it that way, then I don't think it does violate the Eighth Amendment. Which comes to taking a clear position, whether in favor or against the practice. I would say I'm not in favor of it currently because we are using it the wrong way and there is so much corruption in the system that it just became a cruel thing. But if we were to reshape it so that it wasn't being used in the way that it is, then I would agree. Because the problem is when it's so subjective and when people are so corrupted and they're supposed to not be, at that point it's like the people who are supposed to make that change aren't actually working towards making that change. So what really is like the point of it, you know? Like, the point of it is to protect other people, but like, what about the people that you're putting into solitary confinement? You know? Yeah. That was a really bad explanation. I'm so sorry. Now we're getting to psychological and correctional impact. So I looked into this. I think it's a guy. It's an article, but I think it's a guy. His name is Stuart Gracian. He found that solitary confinement induces a psychiatric disorder, which he called the SHU syndrome. And it is characterized by hypersensitivity to external stimuli, hallucinations, panic attack, cognitive deficits, obsessive thinking, paranoia, and a litany of other physical and psychological problems, which I totally agree with. I think if you're isolated for such a long period of time, you are going to develop craziness. You will start hallucinating. Like, it's like that. There's this thing, like a tourist attraction in some country or state or something like that, where you're sitting in the quietest room in the world and you start hearing things. Like, people are like, oh my god, I would love it. I love the quiet. They go in there, within minutes they start going crazy because they start hearing things, even though it's supposed to be the quietest room ever. I think that's the issue. So, with that being said, most researchers do find that solitary confinement is associated with the damaging psychological and physiological consequences that are exaggerated by long-time use, which is why I said I think solitary confinement is better when you are using it to help the person and you are finding ways to help them rather than just lock them up. Like, if they have anger issues, finding someone that can help them resolve those anger issues instead of just pushing them in a room and calling it a day. Because the longer you're in there, the longer you're going to go crazy. So if you really think about it, the longer you're sitting in there, the longer you're going to go crazy and become worse. So, like, they think it's going to be like a timeout corner in elementary school where kids will sit there and reflect on themselves. But no, that's not what's going to happen, like, at all. So, that. Sensory deprivation, lack of human interaction, and physical restrictions could lead to anxiety, insomnia, hallucination, paranoia, decreased brain function, withdrawals, and sensitivity to external stimuli. Like, they're just going to be crazy to everything that is on the outside world because they were locked so much inside of their head. Like, you are so in over your head that you're going to walk out there and you're just going to be like, what in the heck is happening? Like, you're not even going to realize what's going on. Anyways, People in solitary confinement can also, like, on the physical idea of it, could face abuse from other people, especially in double occupancy cells, which is why I talked earlier about how I don't think it is a smart idea. If you're really gonna stick to the book here, why would you put two people who you know have issues and disciplinary issues together? Like, that's like if I was a teacher and I was picking kids for a project and I put Dumb and Dumber together. Like, it just doesn't, like, it's like a clash collide kind of thing, you know? Anyways, the next prompt was discuss how solitary confinement affects people when they return to the general population and re-enter society. In order to leave, they have to prove that they are rehabilitated and are no longer a threat to their institution. But people in solitary confinement frequently do not have access to rehabilitative programming, and the standards determining when people are rehabilitated or no longer a threat are really subjective. Like, again, with the corrupt correctional officers are the ones that are deciding this. It is just a matter of, like, they're not getting help. Like, you're not facing head on the problem, so it's not really doing anything. Like, you're kind of just, it's like, how do I describe this? It's like if I had a mini fire in my hand, and I think that if I put that fire into the ocean, it will burn the entire ocean. Like, it fixes the problem temporarily, but then you let that person back out and the problem just becomes worse. Because now that they have that internal voice inside their head telling them that they're crazy. Did that make sense? I don't think that made that much sense. It's been a long day. I have really bad allergies. For the case example I used that kind of showed this psychological issue with solitary confinement, this was a really popular case. His name is Khalif Browder. He's a 16-year-old from New York who spent 3 years on Rikers Island while awaiting trial because he stole a backpack or something. And because his family couldn't afford bail, he remained there because he said that he was innocent. So he remained at Rikers Island because his family couldn't afford bail. And he didn't want to accept a plea deal, I don't think. His confinement was that he was locked in a 6x9 cell for 23 hours a day. During his isolation, he endured psychological deterioration, including visual hallucinations and multiple suicide attempts. His charges were eventually dismissed, and he was released. Oh, he was also, like, physically beaten up by other inmates and guards. Craziness. Which is why I said corruption is an issue. Anyways, his charges were eventually dismissed, and he was released in 2013. The deep trauma of the isolation stayed with him, and he died by suicide in 2015 at the age of 22. Like, it stuck with him so hard, he couldn't bear himself re-entering into society, despite being found not guilty. Which I think was insane. Anyways, last prompt was alternatives and human rights. An alternative, I think, to solitary confinement could be rehabilitation programs and restorative programs that help people deal with violence, anger issues, and anxiety and stuff like that. Because if your problem is that you have anger issues, you need to find a professional who can deal with that anger issue. Somebody who knows exactly what they're doing. Because you lock them in solitary confinement, that anger issue is going to keep building up in their head until they release it out on somebody else. Whether it be in jail or it be outside of jail. They are going to release that energy back out one way or another, and if they have an outlet of that energy, that is the best course of action, in my opinion. And then for people who are struggling with mental health issues, there are so many mental health institutions that can help, therapy institutions, stuff that will genuinely help them deal with those mental health issues so they aren't harm to themselves or other people around them. I think there's so many alternatives that could help people based on their needs, because solitary confinement can't be a one size fits all. Like, yes, I think some people could benefit from solitary confinement, but not everybody can, and I don't think they understand that. I don't think people understand that they need to have that open outlet for other people. So, yeah. Realistically, these alternatives are feasible, they're cost efficient, they're staffing and safety. Like, it makes sense because a lot of these things are already in action. A lot of these things are already existent. You just need to work with them to provide that source to other inmates. I don't see why it would be not realistic, because these are all already institutions. These are already services that have been provided to normal people. Why can't they be provided to inmates, you know? And I think it would actually cost more to put more people in solitary confinement, because there is such a high level of overcrowding in prisons that it would cost more to keep putting more people in solitary confinement, I fear. So, when it comes to evaluating the balance between institutional security and human rights, I think that solitary confinement in itself is not a bad thing. I think it's just a corrupt system, because people think that putting one person away in confinement and protecting everybody is the good idea. But in reality, there's so many bad seeds in an apple, you know? Like, there's so many bad seeds in this apple. You can't just put one away and expect everything to go back to normal. So, I think we've seen this issue, like, over and over again. And it's something we can't seem to solve, because it's always between security and liberty over and over and over and over again. A really good example was Pearl Harbor. We locked up all the Japanese Americans with the sayings of, like, well, it's to protect our people. What about the people you were locking up? Never thought of that, huh? Like, people just don't understand that you need to have it be on that balance scale, because you can't have one or the other. Because if you put security first and you put human rights at the bottom, I'm not going to feel like I'm secure if I don't have human rights. I don't feel very safe if I don't have human rights. But then on the other hand, if you put human rights above security, it is my human right to feel safe where I'm supposed to be. Which is why I feel like people just don't understand that you have to pick between. You can't pick one or the other. You have to have that balance, and that's just something people don't get yet. Which is why solitary confinement doesn't work out, because they are picking security over human rights, essentially, in that situation. So, this video is really short. I was expecting to talk a little longer. I think I just talk a little too fast, but yeah. That's it. Bye.